Hey there, Dr. Croston. This is Samantha Bragg. Doing my oral argument for our final paper. So the topic I chose for this paper was the use of torture and enhanced interrogation tactics, and I did the Bush administration versus the Obama administration. So the first part of my paper kind of just goes over the use of torture and what it accomplishes and why it's used. And if it's used accurately. So since the start of the War on Terror, we all know that the tactics used in the fight against our new adversaries, such as the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and other non-state actors, it's caused the United States to be heavily criticized. The methods that were being used were thought to be inconsistent with the U.S. morals and values that we were, built on. They were also thought to kind of go against the United States being a human rights proponent. So although many criticized the Bush administration for their methods of interrogation, dealing with these extremists who don't really have any rules of engagement that they abide by, it makes it really difficult for the United States to deal with these non-state actors in the manner that the Geneva Conventions kind of calls for. So in 2007, Bush published an executive order which established that individuals involved in these terrorist groups or that were associated forces with unlawful enemy combatants, they weren't entitled to any of the protections outlined in the Geneva Conventions. This was backed by Congress, who also backed a Military Commissions Act of 2006, which gave the president a more broadened definition of unlawful enemy combatant. It also gave approval for aggressive interrogations, just short of torture. So once Obama came to office, he was very adamant about eradicating this issue of torture or unlawful methods of interrogation. He signed 2 executive orders, one which pretty much set out to close the detention facility in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and the other was to end Bush's CIA program of enhanced interrogation by requiring that the Army Field Manual was to be used as a guide for interrogation going forward. Interestingly enough, Gitmo remains running, and no real changes have been made to the definition of torture that was outlined in that 2006 Military Commissions Act. So while many conventions and treaties do not necessarily outline just how to combat non-state actors, many scholars argue that although terrorism makes us rethink our methods and tactics to protect our freedom, we must not allow ourselves to resort to the tactics of terrorists, such as torture. It can also be argued that enhanced interrogation tactics allow for interrogators to obtain information faster than what would with normal tactics. However, being that the United States is at the forefront, really, of promoting human rights, there becomes sort of a gray area in which we don't want to be viewed as torturers, but we do want to ensure our national security as well. So the question that I really pose is if torture is the only means to secure our national safety, at what point do we rule it out? Since individuals that we now deal with have no moral high ground at all, regarding the tactics that they use in their methods of war, why should we hold them to the standard that we do for those individuals that do abide by the conventions? So the next section of my paper really gives an overview of the policies on torture. So we'll be taking a look at the Bush administration and then the Obama administration. So the Bush administration was really known for taking matters into their own hands when it came to defeating terrorism. A lot of people will argue that the successes that were achieved during the Bush administration, it was done through illegal means. There are some that even go so far as to arguing that the decisions that Bush made regarding the treatment of prisoners and adversaries in the War on Terror has adversely affected the U.S.'s relationship with other nations and hindered the goal of diminishing that global anti-American sentiment that is now, as we are seeing, very much growing. After 9/11, Congress passed the authorization for the use of military force, which really allowed the president to take any necessary and applicable measures to apprehend anyone that was involved in any type of terrorist activity. Bush also decided to move all detainees captured in Afghanistan or Iraq to be held to the U.S. military installation detention facility in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. This was strategically chosen, due to the fact that these individuals being held there weren't really held to the statutory and constitutional habeas corpus rights that would be if they were held on U.S. soil. So like I said before, Obama was really adamant about closing Gitmo and setting up these procedures, or new procedures, that abided more by the U.S. Constitution in his eyes. Obama set up a special task force which would conduct a comprehensive review of the lawful options that the federal government had with respect to apprehension, detention, trial, transfer, and release of detainees. Although he did really set out to change the tone and standard of the war on terror, I can't argue, and not very many scholars that I found are able to argue that little has happened for change to be kind of noticed in the war on terror. So the next section, I wanted to go over how other nations view torture and if it's just a problem in the U.S. So clearly it's not something that's just specific to the United States. Torture and coercion definitions vary basically on a country-to-country basis. So the fact that both of these tactics are really interpreted freely across international water makes it really difficult for different nations to be held to the same standard. The UN Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, or CAT, it provides a very explicit international definition of torture. They say that it's a requirement that a torturous action inflicts severe mental or physical pain, and that the severity of the pain has been extensively utilized as a standard, setting torture apart from lesser offenses in international human rights laws. So even though that the UN really emphasizes severe mental physical pain, the former Yugoslavia International Criminal Tribunal regarded torture as other actions which triggered serious mental and physical suffering that falls short of the severe mental and physical suffering required for other offenses of torture. Also, the European Court of Human Rights proposed that one must give consideration to the notion of torture and that of inhumane, degrading treatment when determining if the act is truly torture. And the U.S. tends to kind of agree with this definition that the European Court of Human Rights kind of proposed. But there's definitely ambiguity when it comes to tactics that may be on the borderline of true torture. So it makes it incredibly difficult to have an international torture standard, and also suggests that there's a lack of reliability to any standard in place because of all the ambiguity and various definitions of torture. So I'm arguing that even if there were to be an international standard on exactly what constitutes as torture, there's no international body that would be able to accurately enforce this standard, so it pretty much leaves nations able to interpret guidelines as they please. So the next part of the paper is how I feel, or how should torture be regarded. So a lot of scholars that I found argue that if we were to legalize torture, it would lower incentives due to the fact that agencies could potentially begin to rely on torture in order to prevent attacks. And this, in fact, could diminish security and increase the likelihood of an attack. And others relate legalizing torture to the use of capital punishment, and that if it were held to standards and controlled, it might not be an issue. But although that torture is nothing new, current government policies are now analyzed at the international level for approval. So nations partaking in torturous activities or tactics will not be viewed as a friend on the international level, which has led many democratic nations to use non-scarring tactics in order to maintain their reputation. So as I mentioned previously, there's no international governing body which is able to hold nations accountable for their actions. However, those that do partake and commit to human rights treaties are held to a very high standard and expectations. So this is why nations as of recent have really received so much scrutiny in regards to their use of torture and enhanced interrogation methods. So during the Bush administration, we saw pretty much a lack of obedience in regards to the Geneva Conventions and the guidelines that were set forth. However, given the fact that these conventions were mandated over half a century ago, some of the circumstances outlined in those conventions don't really apply to current warfare. There's also the issue of vagueness when it comes to actually defining what constitutes as torture. Excuse me. What the U.S. really needs is a clearly stated national position on the issue, not one that is misleading and provides no real guidelines for procedures for the troops in theater. And referring back to the notion of legalizing torture, some scholars argue for torture warrants, which would pretty much legally allow them to conduct interrogational torture. So these warrants would be accepted in cases where an agency has knowledge of an attack and have an individual in custody that is able to provide the vital information necessary to stop the attack from happening. There's also the issue of ambiguity within the text of the Geneva Conventions. So governments tend to rely more on flexible interpretations in regards to military operational requirements. This ambiguity and ability to interpret the treaty as needed for operational requirements is what makes the issue of torture so debatable and frustrating. Should there be a more clear and concise definition of what constitutes as torture, there would be less of a debate on what is acceptable and what isn't. So the U.S. policy regarding torture and enhanced interrogation tactics is in a definite need of revival, given that we're now facing new adversaries and that have never really been defined previously. The treaties and policies regarding the treatment of non-state actors who don't have a moral high ground really need to be revised in order to accurately reflect the type of adversary that the world now faces. The revised treaties and policies should not leave anything to the imagination and should have a clear and concise guidelines as to how everyone should be treated. And I'm losing my voice. Hope you enjoyed it. See ya.